We're live. Josephine, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Um, did I see you did a sprint triathlon at the weekend?
I did. It was awesome, actually. It was so much fun.
Was it?
It was in Brighton. They had closed roads for the bike, so you could just hammer it. I had so much fun.
Nice, nice, nice. Um, so you're a sports psychologist. Can you tell us a bit about how you got into that world?
Yeah, I actually grew up doing ballet and dance until I was about 18, but I was too tall and I looked like a spider having a fit. I wasn't a great dancer. And then I did nothing for years. And then I did some of those Race for Life 5Ks that were really popular about 20 years ago. And I did one of those. And then I did a 10K and then I entered the marathon. And then it's like oh, what's next? And what next was for me was to try triathlon. So I spent 10 years doing triathlon. And I went over to Melbourne in Australia to do the Ironman there. And I was standing on the beach in Frankston where they do the swim bit. And the waves looked awful. I was really, really rough watching them. And the guy on the tannoy, he said, right, guys, you can't control those waves. You can control how you feel about them. And it was a proper light bulb moment going, oh, yeah, I am not naturally sporty, but I am quite clever. And I was like, if I used my brain a bit differently, I could actually make this easier for myself. And I got in the water and I did the swim. Didn't quite come out where we were supposed to come out, but I did the swim. Did the bike and the run, got the best Ironman time I've ever got. And it just really made me think about how can we use sports psychology? And it wasn't so well known about 10 years ago. So I really had to do quite a bit of research. And I quit my job and I went to do a conversion course in psychology. And then I did a master's in sports psychology. And then I discovered you have to do another 3 years of training, which was a bit of a shocker. But I did all of that. And then I've been full-time practicing ever since.
Amazing, awesome. Did you see any of the Ironman World Championships at the weekend?
I was watching bits coming through on Twitter and yeah, catching up on people,
Yeah,
how
they're
they were getting on.
pretty amazing.
Phenomenal marathon time.
Yeah, yeah,
2:32.
yeah, crazy. um, so you've worked with elite athletes, Olympic medalists, all down to your everyday athlete.
Yeah.
Do you find that the problems or what they come into you with are similar issues, completely different?
I tend to see athletes in two categories. And I split them into the very intelligent perfectionists, the VIPs, who have lots of performance anxiety. They overthink everything because they're highly intelligent and their brain is really good at predicting what might happen. And they really, really want to live up to these incredibly high goals and bars that they've set themselves. And the threat system of their brain panics basically that what if I can't do what I've set up to do? Am I who I really believe I am? And so they get quite high levels of performance anxiety. And they will do the sport and they will do the sport well, but their well-being will be rubbish around it. They could have a week before an event with a stomach in absolute knots, just desperately not wanting to do it, finding any excuse that could happen. So there's that performance anxiety group who are usually kind of highly intelligent perfectionists. And you have the group I'm in, the realists. And we're much more about we need to kick up the bum to do some hard work. So for me, I love racing. Racing, I'm in my element. I grinned non-stop for an hour and a half yesterday doing that race. It was awesome. But the training I'm totally lazy about. And the training I need a load of push to get out there and do it. And quite rightly, really, because when you're doing something like a high-end sport that requires quite a lot of time, probably not the healthiest thing you could be doing. Your brain's job is to protect your body and to keep it surviving and functioning really well. And 10, 15 hours of training a week is probably too much. It's a lot more than our body healthily needs. And so that same threat system in the brain is able to kind of go, no, you don't really need to do that. Why don't you skip that bit? And so for the realists, you need someone to push you and to help you find ways to self-motivate. And the perfectionists need someone to kind of help them soothe some of those fears that they have. That's where I tend to work most.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm generalizing here, but I would say most people that listen to this and do HYROX are probably in that first category.
That they are, yeah.
Yeah. To go and do something like that at the weekend for fun. And certainly like the pre-race anxiety is certainly a real thing. So I mean, I guess everyone is different in this regard, but what would you say? How would you work with someone that is suffering with that sort of pre-race anxiety?
So I tend to follow a very specific process where we first do some psych education, kind of the different functions that your brain has when they tend to work, when they tend to overwork and cause you problems, the physicalness that you feel in your body. So if you're highly anxious before an event, or sometimes actually during it, it can have a really strong impact on your performance. If something's very tight, tennis is a really good one to watch this. If you want to watch what physically happens to your body when you're anxious, you watch someone that's just started losing in tennis and they can no longer serve. Suddenly their beautiful serve is all tight and tense and it's gone off in the wrong direction. So most of it's beforehand, but some people are also unfortunately get it during. And we really teach athletes about what's going on in the body then, which bits are working differently and why. And then once you know what's happening to your body, you can start to work out the whys. And I use a process that's based on a psychological approach called ACT, which stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. But my process is called BRAVE. And it breaks down into being aware of the unhelpful thoughts that you're having. So actively tuning into those thoughts. Normally we want to ignore them and forget them, but it's like, no, we want to hear them. We want to know what they are. It's when you know what they are, you can reassign them, that's the R, to the part of your brain that wants you to stay in your comfort zone. Doesn't want you to go and do an event where you're going to get scored and people are going to know how you do and someone might talk about you. It's terrifying, right? You might fail. Like the threat system in your brain is going crazy at that thought. It wants you not to go and it wants you to stay in your comfort zone. It wants you to make some kind of excuse. So we want to reassign the thoughts to that part of our brain that's trying to keep us safe, not to the rest of us that wants to go out and do these cool things.
And sorry to interrupt. Just to say, like, I know you're not necessarily in the HYROX world, but that is very real in HYROX. Like you get a time and it's immediately on the website and you can immediately compare it against people across the whole world. And anyone can see it. Anyone can search your name, you know, if they want to, which they likely don't. But yeah, I think that's very real in HYROX.
Totally. It's probably quite similar to tennis in with rankings and scorings and the speed of that. It means you can't just go and enjoy something like that because you know it's going to be analysed and people will be looking at it. So it can be huge if you're a perfectionist. So you've got the being aware of the thoughts, you reassign them to that part of your brain and we give it a character and a name and a voice and everything. So you get to know that part of your brain and what it's saying to you. Interestingly, men often have their dad's voice with a lot of that criticism that's coming up and telling them they can't do things and stuff. It's just something I've observed a lot, but interestingly, it often happens to be the dad's voice there. Then the A is for advocacy. So starting to give yourself some of those positives back. Because your brain's job is to keep you safe, it is much better at remembering all of the things you have ever messed up in your life, rather than all of the things you've done brilliantly. So if you had a really awful event where your scores dropped and your ranking went massively downhill, that's the one you'll remember, not the 5 or 6 where you did really well. So we have to be really proactive at helping you remember the good stuff. And with athletes, I'll create what's called a tube of truth. And we will pull out all the setbacks they've overcome, the difficult things they've done, great things that other people have said about them, the strengths they have. So they really start to kind of have some evidence for why they should try. Mm-hmm. And the V stands for values. And this is really core of you're feeling a fear. You're going to do it anyway. But why are you going to do it anyway? What matters to you? What is it about the person that you are that means you're going to go and try? And then the E is engaging. So it's lots of little things to make you focus on the tasks ahead of you and not the outcomes, because outcomes are what's scary. What's my score going to be, and what's so-and-so going to say about it? And what does that mean about who I am? But tasks are doable. So if it's, and I don't know your sport at all, but if it's, I'm just going to go in there and I am going to do 10 pull-ups, that feels much more, right, just one pull-up at a time. Not, if I get 10, it would give me this score, which would mean X, which would mean this. So we want to pull everything back to tasks, things on the ground that you can do right now. When you practice that process, you still hear some of the unhelpful messages, but they don't hurt you in the same way. They don't cause you illness that stops you turning up. And they don't prevent you then achieving what you want.
Trust in the process, I guess.
Yeah. You have to learn the process. But yes, when you've learned the process, you just sit back and follow it. And that stops your brain thinking about the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you feel like there's any misconceptions about what it takes to be, we'll say, very good at a sport or elite? And like, I'm thinking, like, for example, like, have you seen The Last Dance on Netflix?
Yep.
with Michael Jordan? Like, I think it's probably easy to come away from that and just say, well, like to be great, you've got to be a bit of an arsehole. And like, and
I think they call it selfish.
All right, yeah, well, that'd be better worded. And maybe unpopular and like crazy driven. Like, do you feel like that's accurate, or do you feel like it's a misconception?
I think it's nice and easy to say, and I do think actually an elite athlete has to focus vast amounts of time on being an elite athlete. It isn't just doing your training. It's the extra sleep you need to recover from the training and to get strong enough. It's the fact you will have to invest time in camps, which might mean you miss important other things in your life. So there does need to be an intensity and a real proactive focus on what you want to achieve. I often work with elite athletes on a no regrets approach. They want to, whether they make it or not, they want hand on heart to be able to say, I gave it everything. And that does require some difficult choices. However, I think whether you're successful or not is not whether you follow a certain set of rules. It's whether you are able to figure out what works for you and your personality and your characteristics and your background. And because I work so much with perfectionism, I think that's a huge one. Coaches working with perfectionists need to do things very differently with those athletes than they would with a realist who's probably a bit lazy. Mm-hmm. And so a realist can be just as good as a perfectionist, but they will need a different approach and they'll need different ways of doing things. And if you go into an environment where there's specific rules, we must all do this, we must all do this, you're going to get people that are injured very quickly, because one person might be able to do 20 hours of exercise a week with no issue, and another person might only be able to cope with 7 or 8 before whatever's going on in their body starts to break down. Similarly, I know someone joins the local tennis club and they're really enjoying playing matches. And then someone in that group says, oh, why don't we start scoring these? Why don't we create a little ladder of where we go up and down? So it'll really motivate us. And for half the guys, that does motivate them. And the other half, they're now utterly terrified of turning up to any training and they want to quit. So much more what I try and do when working with elite athletes who want to be professional or are professional is not trying to adhere to these are the rules for how you do it, but adhering to a real internal insight. What works for you and how do you do more of that? What are you driven by? And if you find out what drives them, then you can really adapt. And they will each be more successful. But it has to be individual. There isn't like it'd be lovely if there was a rule book. You must train X amount of hours per week. You must have this level of mental I hate the phrase mental toughness, but that kind of idea, if you must do this, you must, I know, build this. It doesn't work like that. It has to be really individual.
Okay, makes sense. With all that said, are there any common traits that you do see in the elite athletes?
It's hard because I run a private practice. So it's not like I'm sitting in a team and can go, well, the best athletes all have this in common. Yeah, people come to me when there's an issue. So they didn't pay for it otherwise. So I tend to see very similar people, and they're often the people with performance anxiety. I guess what I see, the people that come out of the process and are doing brilliantly are those who are really open to understanding themselves and to being really flexible with what that means. So, and I guess that's like a real honesty with yourself, a real ability to say, I'm going to try whatever it takes, rather than feeling like there's a very closed way of doing things. And that I find really helpful. And people that have that real vulnerability, talking about things like values can be a bit weird sometimes, and it feels a bit difficult because you're really opening yourself up to what's at the core of who I am, what really matters to me. But if someone's willing to go through that process, they can push themselves to levels they never knew they could push themselves to before. A basic example, but a guy I once did a workshop with, we were talking about motivational mantras and kind of what would work as a good mantra to get you through and get you working harder at something. And he said, I used to be super, super overweight. I went to the doctors. Doctors told me I wouldn't make it to 30 unless I sorted my health out. He was like, it was the kick I needed. He said, I went to the gym. I trained really hard. I went on a diet. I lost loads of weight. I ended up joining a triathlon club, which is how I'd ended up meeting him. And he said, I did my first triathlon. Swim was awful, but I got through it. Bike was awful, but I got through it. The run, I wanted to quit. It was horrible. And he said, I ran past my dad. My dad said to the guy standing next to him, that's my son. And he's like, damn it. Because it sounded like he was so proud of him. He was like, I can't quit now, can I? He was like, any tricky thing that comes up now, all he hears in his head is his dad's voice going, that's my son. And at that point, he finds that extra bit of energy that you need to be able to push yourself harder. And I think for all of us, if we know why we are doing something, why it matters, we can find that extra bit of energy. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine for the kind of competitions that your listeners are doing, you're going to get to points where you feel exhausted. You feel like you're totally empty. But research has shown they do muscle biopsies to find this out. Which sounds horrific, but they will actually biopsy muscle when somebody says they're at total exhaustion. There's about 30% of energy left. So when our body shuts us down because we're exhausted, we're not. We've got extra if we need it. We just need to learn how to untap it. And the latest research suggests there's two ways. One is maxing out your motivation, so to absolutely know why you're doing it. And the other one is to reduce your perception of effort, so finding ways to make things feel a little bit easier for you. And if you can tap into those, then you can get the extra 30% out.
Okay. I said that funny enough, that was going to be my next question about, what would you advise to someone when it is in the depths of the race, what to think about? And it's something that when I talk to a lot of the athletes on this podcast, it's a question I always ask them. But understanding your why, I think that makes sense. What would you say the second part about how to make something easier? Like what would you advise there?
So there's lots of things we use. It's about reducing your perception of effort, so your brain doesn't think what it's doing is as difficult as it is, so that it stops kind of almost tensing up and trying to stop the efforts. A really simple one, smiling. When you smile, it tricks your brain into thinking what you're doing is a little bit more enjoyable, a little bit easier. And there's been great research on this. There is also research to show when someone smiles at you, it feels a little bit easier. So they did some lovely research in the lab with cyclists on bikes, where they flashed up very, very quick images of faces whilst people were cycling. Those who saw smiley faces were able to go 16% longer than those that saw like growly, grumpy faces. So I love the idea that when we're doing something and they're spectators, if we smile, they smile back at us. And the triathlon I did yesterday, I was grinning the whole way because it was awesome. But there was one marshal near one of the turnaround points, and he was just yelling about smiling. And he had this great big grin on his face. And you could really almost suck in the energy that he was giving out through that. It's amazing. So if people can smile during events, brilliant. Caffeine, if it works for you. So for some people, they're pretty much caffeine non-responders. Not going to make much difference. But if you're a responder to it, that can make what you're doing feel a lot easier. Chunking stuff down is good. So I've recently been working with people doing UTMB, I think it's 171 kilometers round some serious mountain climbs. And it's the biggest ultra distance race in the world, really. It's the one everyone tries to qualify for. But if imagine standing on the start line thinking, I've got 171 kilometers to go, and I think they have 37 hours to do it or something. It's huge, way too big for our brain stuff. But if you chunk it down, I've got 10 until that aid station, and I've got 12 until that thing. Suddenly it's doable. I just have to go for another 10, and then I get a rest, or I get to do whatever. So the more you can chunk down what you're doing and just focus on that little bit in front of you, that's really helpful. If it's quite an intense race, you want to be doing focus. So you want to be looking internally. And often then we'll be doing things like body checking. I love that annoying song, which you're now going to have in your head for the rest of the day. Head, shoulders, knees and toes. Because you can then run through your body, right? What's my head doing? My shoulders, how movable are they? Am I in the right position for the move that I'm doing? How are my knees? And then how are my feet? And then you can switch on occasionally with eyes, ears. Am I tuned in to what's going on? But you're giving yourself a body check of, am I in the right position that I need to be in? And if I'm not, then how do I move it so I am? If you're doing longer stuff, distraction is good. So think about the tweet you're going to send afterwards. Think about the best. I did London Marathon recently, and some of the signs that people had were awesome. And I was having like a mini competition in my head for like, what's the best sign? Which one do I want to remember afterwards? So anything like that is really good. And another one is having support from people. So if people go off to do events in teams, that can be really powerful. I often say when someone's doing something like a marathon, you need your key supporter in a strategic point, because you want to be looking forward to seeing them, and they want to pre-agree the kind of thing you're going to shout out. My daughter and I have this silly move that we do from Barbie Mermaids. But when I see her in a race, we do our silly move. And it makes me smile. It makes me feel happy for another 5 minutes. Brilliant. So things like that, that can help keep your head in the game, but just make it feel like it's less difficult than it is. Really good at pushing you further.
Yeah. And what you were saying about the chunking, especially, is quite relevant to HYROX. And some athletes have told me that they use that actually because in HYROX, like, you run a kilometer and then you've got to do the ski, and then you run a kilometer and you do something else. And it's quite nice that it is broken down. There's always something new about to happen, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what's nice actually is then there's a chemical in our brain called dopamine, which we get as a reward chemical when we've ticked something off. And it sounds like you guys have that set off perfectly. It's like, I've done that kilometer run, right? I tick it off. I get that bit of dopamine. That helps push you into the next thing.
Yeah. So
really using that of kind of ticking off as you go through is an excellent way of feeling good about what you're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned about, well, I thought of it really when you said about distraction and distracting yourself when and there's a lot going on. Within HYROX, you do need to, mistakes are very easily made. Like you do need to sort of maintain your concentration, if you like, because you need to remember what you're going to go and do next. Is it burpees next, or is it farmers carries? Is it lunges? And also, like, so you've got to remember the order of the 8 stations, and then also you have to remember how many laps you've got to run. So it might be in a convention center like the XL, for example, and you might have to run 3 laps of that. So when you're doing it and you're tired, you're like, have I run 2? Have I run 3? Have I run 4? It's surprisingly easy to make those mistakes. Do you have any advice on that, and like maintaining that sort of concentration when you're struggling and your body's probably like low on oxygen and everything like that, to minimize mistakes during a race?
It's a really interesting one, actually. We know that you have about 2.5 times your age in minutes of concentration until you're an adult, which is very handy to remember. If anyone's listening has got children, I used to like set up the paint set for my daughter, and I think this is going to be a beautiful thing we can do together, right? And within 10 minutes, she's done it. She's bored. She's wandered off. And I'm like, well, it took me 20 minutes to set this up. It's ridiculous.
I had that, exactly that yesterday in the garden, actually. Like we took about 20 minutes to set it up, and it lasted like 2. It was crazy.
Yeah. Yes. And it was infuriating. And then I discovered this thing about 2.5 times your age. And I was like, well, 3-year-old, you're lucky if you're going to get 7 or 8 minutes out of them. That makes sense. Okay. It's not that I'm a rubbish parent. It's a normal developmental phase. Can cope with that. So I think it's quite handy to remember that bit until we get to adults. And then it's about 45 minutes of attention and focus we've got. So if your event is around that, you can practice and build up to that. When you're getting over that, you have to learn to switch off at certain points. We just don't have that much tension. It's why before I trained in sports psychology, I used to joke that golf wasn't a real sport. I was really cynical about golf, right? And then I've been out on the course with golfers. It's one of the hardest. They're out there for like 4 or 5 hours, and they're supposed to concentrate for that amount of time. It's impossible. So I have a massive respect for golfers now, because just the attention and the concentration they need is huge. But what we'll work with golfers is, how do you switch on and off? So it might be it's 3 laps and you're repeating something to get it through. And often an instructional mantra is really helpful for that. 3, 3, 3 until you finish the 3rd lap. 2, 2, 2. But you would need to try and find times to switch on and off. And maybe when you see what the schedule is, to then be able to plan, oh, I'll daydream at that point, or I'll think of this, so that you do allow your brain time that it doesn't have to focus so much. The other thing that really helps us is habit. So the more you have, I don't know how long in advance people will get the guidance of what they would need to do.
It's the same workout every time in HYROX, exactly the same. Yeah.
Then you just practice doing the same thing over again. And one of the things I talked about, the psychoeducation, when we teach people about the kind of the threat function, is we're also teaching about the habit function and the decision function. And habits take, the research suggests, 66 days to make. So you might practice something and think, I've practiced that, it's there for the weekend. It's not. As soon as something happens at the weekend, like you get distracted by somebody, or you see your score go down and you start to panic about it, the threat part of the brain has kicked in and you can't access the decision bit much. You need it in the habit zone. You need to have practiced it so much. So if it's all the same, then you just practice and practice until, there's a lovely Johnny Wilkinson quote, apparently, don't do something till you get it right. Do it until you cannot get it wrong. And that bit, you just have to do the same thing and run through it and make words and phrases that tell you what to do. But any of those shortcuts are really helpful.
Okay, makes sense. I think like HYROX is in its relatively early days, and obviously everyone takes it different levels of seriousness. But I think for some, it has become a little bit of an addiction, in that like you get a time and the race is the same sort of every time. And so then you've got a time to beat.
Yeah.
And so on, it just continues forever, really. But and you get a ton of data about every element of the race. So it can become a bit of an addiction, and maybe in some cases replaces other addictions that are probably less healthy in reality. Do you see that often? And I mean, I know that's a broad question, but like, what would you advise to someone that feels like maybe they're in that situation?
The exercise addiction isn't particularly unusual. It's a tricky one because it's almost like a badge of honor. There's a local race company to me in London and called The Fix, and they put run addiction all over their medals. And it infuriates me because I'm like, I get to see the outcome of exercise addiction, which isn't good. We shouldn't be celebrating it. We should actually be helping people to have much more of a balanced thing. But particularly if we've got, say, a perfectionistic mindset, then yeah, anything where you're scored the whole time, where you can try and improve on it, where you get better the more you do, that's going to be a real driver. And part of the issue with addiction, behavioral addictions, is we only classify something as a behavioral addiction when it causes you harm. So for a 20-year-old at university, hasn't got many hours of study, they could probably do 20 hours a week of HYROX stuff and they'd be okay, as long as they're getting the recovery in. And if they've got a strong body that doesn't tend to get injured with no kind of biomechanical difficulties, they can do it. It's not causing any harm. It's not causing any fallouts with other people. They're not getting injured. Rock on. But you've got a dad of two who's 40, who's got a full-time job, family commitments with kids to look after, probably some knee issues from sport they've done in the past, and they try and do 20 hours a week. They're going to be falling out with their wife big time. They're going to be having a poor relationship with their kids. They're not going to be putting what they should into work, and it's going to cause them burnout. So they're going to have some physical issues. So it's not so much how much you do, but it's the impact it has on the rest of your life. And that can be really hard, because if you're in a group training with other people and you can see what others are doing, and yet you don't have family or life circumstances that allow you to do the same, it will be really difficult. And you see them getting better and you see them getting higher scores, you want to do it too. And you have that real pull. And sometimes that pull can win, because each time you get a better score, you get the dopamine buzz and you're absolutely craving that buzz, so you do a bit more. And so at that point, I mean, I come from the Ironman background. You see a lot of 50-year-old men who were divorced and cycling similarly, because that was their thing and they loved it so much and they got their escape from it and they felt a sense of belonging, but it became too much and it took over other things. And the other issue that can come alongside it, when you overtrain, you can often underfuel. So you don't eat what you need to in order to fuel all the exercise you're doing. For women, that causes lots of fertility issues. For men, they tend to get lots of stress fractures. And so that can become really harmful as well. So it is a really important thing to kind of keep an eye on. Am I doing too much? Is this impacting other parts of my life negatively?
That last point on underfueling, I do nutrition calls with athletes, and it's something that I see an awful lot, because a lot of people are coming from a like body composition background, you know, just training in the gym every day, training in the gym, trying to look great, and then coming into HYROX and trying to perform.
Yeah.
And like the diet required for that, and specifically like the amount of carbs that you might need to be able to do that is vastly different. So yeah, it's certainly something I'm seeing a lot.
And really importantly with the carbs, if they're not being taken and you're not fueling properly, your brain is about 2 to 5% of your body weight, but it takes 20% of the energy that we put into our body, specifically glucose, which you get from the carbs. It loves glucose. If you're underfueling, you can't access the habit or the decision part of your brain. You're living on the threat system. And so you end up being quite aggressive or falling out with people often. And it really gets you into this difficult place of like, you need your sport to feel normal and to feel like you, but it's actually also causing you real damage in other parts of your life.
Yeah. And then possibly also making those mistakes that we spoke about earlier.
Totally.
But, yeah.
The one that always got me was when I work quite a lot in rowing, and coxes have to be very small and light. And so often, like race day, they'll be like, oh, I don't eat race day. And you're like, but you're the one stopping them crashing into the other boats or into the bank. And you're having to like shout and give your energy over to the team. And you haven't fueled your brain. There's no way to do that.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions, if that's okay. Just maybe following on from that point about, you know, like the addiction and overtraining. We work with some clients and, you know, write training programs and so on, and it's not uncommon to see people wanting to do more than what is being programmed for them, which is probably a better problem to have than people not wanting to do the training, maybe. But yeah, what if someone's listening that falls into that trap, what would you say?
So that tends to be very common with perfectionists, and they're constantly wanting to do more and more and more. They'll have set a bar here and they're constantly trying to strive towards it. Even when they get there, they'll just raise the bar, but they're constantly looking at what else should I be doing? How do I do that? So yes, it means they're incredibly motivated, but they're also much more likely to get injured. So the more coaches can talk about how the rest and recovery is where you get strong, and it's only by the extra sleep. And a cycling coach once told me for every extra hour of cycle training they put into an elite athlete's training for the week, they needed an extra hour's sleep per night. And I thought that was an excellent way of making people realize the more you add in the training, the more injuring you're pulling your body apart. It needs all of the extra rest and recovery to actually get stronger. Otherwise, you're just digging yourself into a big hole. And so the more coaches can talk about the rest and recovery and how that's when you get strong and where the focus needs to be, I think that helps athletes realize it's not just about doing more of the exercise. And I often use, it's called coin theory. So this idea that you've got 100 modules of energy, attention, focus to use each day. And each day when you wake up, you need to work out where you're going to use them. And if you've got a super hard training session, that might be 25, 30 coins that you're using up. If you've got a busy work day, that's probably going to be 40 or 50. If you know you're going to have a difficult conversation with your kids about something hard, that might be another kind of group of coins. And you've only got 100 all day. So if you're using up 50 with 2 training sessions a day, and you're trying to squeeze work in and other bits, you're not going to recover. So you're just going to get into debt and more likely to get injured. And you can't be a good parent, a good co-worker, or a good anything else. So I really like that idea of look how many coins you're spending. If you want to go and do this session properly, really hard as it's set, that's 30 coins. How are you going to recover from it? How might you earn back some coins? And that might be, actually, I'm going to go and sit in the spa afterwards at my gym, because that always makes me feel really good. Great. You might earn 5 coins back after that. But really think through, how do you spend your energy each day? Because coach will only have foresight of what exercise they're doing, but they might well have a difficult conversation they need to have with their wife or their husband afterwards that's not taken into account. So many athletes will say, I know I should tell my coach this, but I've got X, Y, and Z going on at work at the moment, or I'm really worried I'm about to be made redundant. Or if you're in that boat, every conversation you have at work, your threat system's on high alert. Is this where I'm going to be made redundant? Is this what's going on? And you're using up so many coins for that, you can't use them for your exercise. So throwing in an extra session at that point would be totally pointless. You just dig yourself into a hole. So the more coaches can try and find out about the wider bits of lives going on as well, and talk to athletes about really spreading their coins properly so they're not overdoing it, then they can see that doing a few sessions super, super hard and a lot of sessions easy is going to be much better than just piling on more and more.
Yeah, that's great. You've written a number of books.
Yeah.
One of which is it The Teenager's Guide to Mental Fitness?
Yes, it's called The Teenager's Guide to Mental Fitness.
And I've heard you, I must admit, I've not read it yet, but I've heard you talking about it and sort of certain aspects to consider when working with youngsters. And obviously there's going to be a lot of parents listening to this. But one thing I heard you specifically talk about was emotional vocabulary with kids, which I thought was a really interesting area, and probably one that maybe a lot of people don't think of when talking with teenagers. Can you just touch on that topic a little bit for us?
Yeah, it actually came up for me because I was on a course on eating disorders, and the person running the course was talking about, they call it the kind of the evil triad, the 3 characteristics that those that are most susceptible to eating disorders tend to have. So there's sensitivity, anxiety, and perfectionism. And particularly for girls with things like anorexia, we often tend to see those. And the phrase, she's really kind. Those things tend to be seen much more in girls that go on to develop an eating disorder. And one of the people on the course with me suddenly just looked utterly terrified. She's like, my God, my daughter's got all of those. I always describe her as kind. She's super sensitive, highly perfectionistic. Is there any way we can protect them? And the lady running the course was like, yes, work on their emotional literacy. The more ways teenagers and kids, I do it with my 6-year-old, the more ways they have to describe how they are feeling, the better coping mechanisms they can develop to handle what they're feeling. If you don't have many coping mechanisms, particularly because you only have 4 or 5 words that you tend to use how you're feeling, you're going to pick the wrong coping mechanisms. And one of those might be controlling what you eat. So I work very specifically on what emotional words do you tend to use. And we tend to have about 6 or 7 each. Like I call them the lazy emotions. So I'm tired, I'm angry, I'm happy, really basic words. Then for each of those, I will pull out 7 or 8 that are similar, but much more specific. And it's in it's also in the 10 Pillars of Success, which is my latest book for adults. And there's literally a page in there where you can see this is a lazy word, but around the outside, there's 8 much more specific words. And so if my daughter says, oh, I'm just tired, I'm like, which word are you really? And we'll go and look at the sheet and she'll be like, oh, I'm actually a bit overwhelmed. Okay, why are you overwhelmed? Oh, because so-and-so said this to me in the playground today, and I know I'm supposed to be doing my guitar practice, and I've also got homework, and you're going to have a go at me for not doing my homework, but and we'll go into it. But a much easier way to have a conversation of like, okay, let's talk about this girl in the playground, right? Let's write about it, put it into Worry Monster's mouth, see how we can handle that, and I'll have a word with the teacher. Homework bit. All right, why don't we just do half an hour now? And then you've got a bit of that stress out of the way. So that's a good way of handling it. And you can really help them as a parent deal with those worries because they're actually able to describe what they're feeling. And so we know it protects from eating disorders, but we know it also starts to protect from kind of anxiety issues, depression, because you can be specific with, I'm feeling this, I've investigated it, I've pulled it apart. This is what I'm actually feeling. Right, how do we handle that? That's a specific coping mechanism. You're sorted.
Brilliant. Love it. All right, thank you. One last question, one that I ask everyone on here is if you could put a message out to the world on a billboard for everyone to see,
ooh,
what would it be? I'm sorry, I should have.
What a great question. I should have prepared. Either. Can I have 2?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So the positive one is you never know unless you try.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that bit's really important. Fear stops us doing too much. And the other one would be let's ban the word perfect. Because
why do that? Just because
it's impossible. It doesn't exist. And it's now an impossible measurement that we are never going to meet up to. And we beat ourselves up for not being able to do it. And I see how many people then don't try, and the harm it causes, and the way people just restrict themselves, stop attempting things because they might not be perfect. Whereas if we got rid of that word, and if we never expected to be perfect, we would go out and have so much more fun.
Perfect. All right. Perfect.
See? So easy, isn't it?
It is. It is. Thanks so much for doing this. It's been fantastic. Where should people go if they want to find out more about you, learn more about what you're doing?
And so I have a website called performanceinmind.co.uk. For kids, I have the Teenage Athlete's Guide to Mental Fitness. For adults, I have a book called The 10 Pillars of Success. And for coaches, I have a book called Performing Under Pressure, which lists lots and lots of techniques you can use with athletes to help improve their mental performance.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. It's been brilliant. And maybe I'll see you at a HYROX one day.
Well, I'll get my husband there. He'd be awesome at it. Yes.
Okay. All right. Lovely. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.